We're right at noon. First of all, let me thank you all for joining us. I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation. I'm one of the founding members of the Afghanistan Study Group. It's a real pleasure to have all of you with us. We're also streaming live on a good number of blogs today, including the New America website and the Washington Note. We also have C-SPAN here today, and I want to say a special welcome to all of the C-SPAN viewers that are with us. About 9 months ago, a number of us sat down at a dinner in this room and thought about what if policy in Afghanistan, after the announced surge and the change in course that President Obama put in place, what if things just didn't work out? We tried to create a broad group of people, I would say from the global justice left to the hard-nosed, unsentimental national interest right. We missed a few corners here and there, I'm sure. This is a discussion that has so many different corners and so many different significant players whom I respect involved in it, but we didn't see an organized effort to really begin trying to raise a significant and coherent counterpoint to that argument that was pretty much dominated, in my personal view, by the Pentagon. And so we wanted to try to bring together a good, talented group of people. Some of those members are here today. Some of them signed the report. Some of them have not signed the report. We're issuing today A New Way Forward, Rethinking U.S. Strategy in Afghanistan. We have about 40 signers of the report right now. It's available and can be downloaded for free on the website. Don't type www, but just afghanistanstudygroup.org, and that will take you right to this report. Matthew Ho, many of you know, a former Foreign Service officer and U.S. Marine stationed in Afghanistan, has recently become our new director of this project, and I want to formally welcome Matt to this effort, and he's at the helm of what we're going to be doing. And we have today here a number of talented people to discuss U.S. Afghanistan policy from different corners, discuss and react to the report if they feel so inclined, and talk about the broad challenges. One of the people that we have online is the president of the organization, the New America Foundation, Steve Call. Steve, as many of you know, is one of the nation's leading experts on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, Pulitzer Prize winning author of the book Ghost Wars. And Steve is joining us from New York and is going to share some of his thoughts as well, in part because in the spirit of how New America was put together, we have a heterodox arrangement where I know Steve has nuanced differences. In fact, the two of us debated each other in New York on two different teams in one of these Intelligence Squared debates. And I think it would be hard-pressed to find any other think tank in town that had two leading players on opposite sides of an issue. But our opposite sides are more nuanced than really embedded. And I'm honored that Steve is with us. I do want to just point out Bill Goodfellow here of the Center for National Policy, who's an institutional partner with New America in helping to push this along. So, Bill, thank you very much for your support. And Richard Vague. Richard Vague has been is a business leader from Philadelphia, a conservative businessman who's gotten deeply involved in these questions and a very big supporter of the American Strategy Program. So thanks to Richard. We have with us today Paul Pillar, who's Director of Graduate Studies at the Center for Peace and Security Studies at Georgetown University. He's former National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia. Many of you know him from his work and commentary on the Near East, and we're very pleased to have Paul as a member of the study group and someone who's going to help articulate and share the key points of our report. Matthew Ho, who I mentioned, a former Afghanistan-based official with the Department of State and U.S. Marine Corps, is our new director of the Afghanistan Study Group, and we'll be seeing him. We have a 6-month surge of our own to take the ideas in this report and surge them into the media, so we plan to have Matthew there just about every day, weekends included, so you'll all get to know Matt very well. Steve Call, as I mentioned, is online. Brian Katulis, great friend and supporter, fellow traveler, someone who is very important in helping us to think through many of the key parts of this effort, but someone who remained outside, not a signer, but he is really one of the I think, leading jousters in this question of where do you take U.S. Afghanistan policy. You have tremendous respect for Brian, who's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Charles Kupchan is the Whitney Shepardson Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University, and author of the very important must-read book, How Enemies Become Friends. I think it's one of the most interesting pieces in international relations theory out there right now. We were pleased to be the launch site for that book. Darcy Berner is my favorite person on the far left. Maybe that's an inappropriate cast for Darcy. Darcy, of course, ran for Congress in Washington State. We're hoping that she comes back, maybe not this next time, but the next time. She's director of the American Progressive Caucus Policy Foundation, and she really gave this progress project sizzle and energy and real passion, and helped teach us a lot about many of the burning issues. Robert Pape is a professor of political science at University of Chicago. He's also the director of the Chicago Project on Suicide Terrorism. With so many people watching online right now, I do recommend that you go to the C-Post website. You'll learn more about what's going on with terrorism, what drives terrorism, what the component pieces are, and not in kind of the ways that you would think, that basically you look at, if you were going to try and undermine this tendency, what would you do? One of the things that's part of this report is big military footprints don't help. So I would Bob is also author of Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, and in October, we're going to be launching his new book, Cutting the Fuse, The Explosion of Global Suicide Terrorism and How to Stop It, in a major conference here in Washington, D.C., that all of you will be invited to if you like. So I'd like to, as we begin, and I'm going to, just in truth in advertising, I'm going to be doing Andrea Mitchell's show shortly at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to be here for just about 15 or 20 minutes, and then Matt Ho is going to take over until I come back. So, but I'd like to turn the floor over to Paul Pillar, who's going to start and help introduce the report. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. And I want to compliment and thank Steve Clemens for his excellent leadership and initiative in this whole project, as well as seconding everything he said by way of thanks to everyone else. This report and the discussions that led to it are a recognition, in my view, of the fact that U.S. policy toward Afghanistan and much of the discourse that has surrounded it here in Washington has lost sight of what is or is not at stake in Afghanistan, and certainly has lost sight of any careful comparison between costs and benefits of waging the continued counterinsurgency there. That counterinsurgency, with the goals of defeating the Afghan Taliban and stabilizing Afghanistan, has come to be treated as a kind of end in itself. It is not an end in itself. It is, to put it rather bluntly, the result of a 9-year-long mission creep that has accompanied our presence there, and that represents a major displacement from the original reason for our military intervention in Afghanistan back in 2001, which was to roust al-Qaeda from its Afghan home and to oust the Taliban from power, its then allies, the Taliban. The principal subject of this report thus focuses on the disconnect between the stated rationale of keeping Americans safer from terrorism and the actual operational objectives of defeating militarily the Afghan Taliban and nation building in Afghanistan. The conflict in Afghanistan is commonly perceived as a struggle between, on the one hand, the Karzai government, and on the other hand, an insurgent Taliban movement allied with international terrorists, whereas in fact it is a complicated, messy civil war that has various dimensions that are, quite frankly, almost hard to keep track of: ethnic, sectarian, rural, urban, as well as other lines of conflict. A U.S. military victory over the Taliban is simply not necessary to protect U.S. interests, for several reasons that the report addresses. The Taliban itself is not an international terrorist group. It is instead a mostly rural-based insurgency that is interested in the political and social order inside Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is barely in Afghanistan at all. Even if given the opportunity to return to Afghanistan, it's not at all apparent that al-Qaeda would see a net advantage in doing so in comparison to its current presence in Pakistan and its activities elsewhere. And even if it wanted to return, it's doubtful that even a victorious Afghan Taliban would want it back, given what happened to it the last time it had al-Qaeda as a guest and it conducted a major terrorist operation. And even if al-Qaeda or another terrorist group attempted to reestablish anything like the presence that the group had in Afghanistan prior to 2001, it would, unlike 2001, since the national rules of engagement, if you will, have drastically changed post 9/11, it would quickly become the target of liberal use of standoff U.S. air power to destroy it. And even if some sort of haven were to be reestablished in Afghanistan, a physical haven is simply not one of the more important assets that determines the degree of threat that al-Qaeda or any other terrorist group poses to us. Think about it. Right now, they don't have a haven there. Are we not worried about al-Qaeda? Do they not pose a threat? Of course they do. So the question that has to be asked is, how much more of a threat would they pose beyond what they already pose now? And the answer is, in my judgment, not much. Although much of the report then focuses on that disconnect between the stated rationales and the actual operational objectives, it does address the policy questions at a couple of other levels. One is the dim prospect for success, even accepting the counterinsurgency on its own terms. Given the nature of counterinsurgency, you can go read General Petraeus' manual on this, creating a unified and reasonably stable Afghanistan would require many more American lives and hundreds of billions of additional U.S. dollars for years to come. The effort does not have the cooperation, or at least the full cooperation, of Pakistan, which continues to provide support under the table to the Afghan Taliban as an instrument of influence and a hedge against influence against events in Afghanistan. And even more important, the effort does not have an uncorrupt Afghan government with the potential for obtaining greater legitimacy than it does now. And the stories break almost daily about problems of graft and corruption in that particular government. Another dimension the report addresses is the counterproductive nature of much of what we are doing, recognizing that stated purpose of keeping Americans safe from terrorism. We have, through what has become an increasingly unpopular military occupation, been creating enemies faster than we've been creating friends. Much of the motivation for Taliban recruits has been resistance of foreign occupation, a subject that Robert Pape is the foremost expert on. Our presence also encourages closer cooperation, as the report points out, among a disparate array of extremist groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan alike. We've brought the enemies together. And even more broadly, resentment over our military presence in Afghanistan is increasing the resonance of extremist propaganda and inspiring still others, lending credibility to the extremist narrative, including inspiring some right here in the United States to turn to terrorism. A final dimension the report addresses is the sheer and immense cost of this expedition, including not only the tragic human costs, but also the monetary expenditures which are costing U.S. taxpayers at a rate of nearly $100 billion a year. This is economically damaging, especially given the current state of the public finances. It represents a huge opportunity cost, and it calls into question nearly all of the benefits or alleged benefits of the expedition, each of which must be measured against the yardstick of whether the benefits outweigh the cost being incurred. The report posits not a specific detailed proposal, but more of a redirection of policy in several respects. And I should emphasize, as Steve Clemens did, that not even all the signatories would agree to everything here, especially when it comes to the recommendations. But I would just highlight three of the general changes in trajectory, that's the way that I would put it, that the report calls for. One is a downsizing and eventual ending of the military operations in southern Afghanistan while substantially reducing the U.S. military footprint. Another would be placing greater emphasis than we are now on power sharing and political inclusion among different contending factions in Afghanistan, with the emphasis on decentralizing power in a country which has never really had an effective central government that has controlled all of the territory. And another emphasis, engaging more energetically the regional and global stakeholders in a diplomatic effort designed to guarantee Afghan integrity and neutrality and to foster regional stability. We're not the only ones, by a long shot, that have a stake here. As I said, these are changes in emphasis and trajectory. Probably the most visible difference from the current trajectory has to do with the size of the U.S. military presence and the pace of a drawdown, which, as you'll see in the report, is really different from all the indications we've been getting lately from our leadership, civilian and military, about what we should expect come next July. I'd conclude by observing that this report, at least as much as calling for changes in trajectory, is calling for changes in how we think about Afghanistan. It's an appeal not to let, as I'm afraid we have let this happen over the 9 years, sheer momentum continue to carry us into expanded objectives, but instead we should ponder and not just recite why we're supposedly there, and to consider precisely how what we're doing there does or does not advance U.S. interests. And with that, Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Paul. I want to thank Steve Clemens for organizing this effort, as well as Bill Goodfell's leadership on this and the support of New America, as well as the Center for International Policy. Also want to thank all the members of the team that we've assembled, their consensus is found in this report. What I would say is the most important thing for people to consider when they view this report is that this is the work of a network of foreign and public policy practitioners, professionals, experts. And while probably no one agrees with 100% of the report, including myself, the basis of it is, or the fact of it is, that we have a failing and counterproductive strategy in Afghanistan. And that should be the focus of the report. I don't want people to get too worried about the details of it. We have 5 tenets of the report that we've come to a consensus on as a new way forward, a new approach for U.S. strategy in Afghanistan. But the overwhelming arch of this is that our policy for several years has been not just failing, but counterproductive. I'd like to read a quote from you, and then I'll come back to it in a moment. What we're doing is moving to a more classic counterinsurgency strategy here in Afghanistan. That's a fairly significant change in terms of our tactical approach out there on the ground. The approach, he said, will give soldiers great depth of knowledge, understanding, and much better intelligence access to the local people in those areas by owning, as it were, those chunks of territory. It sounds very familiar, correct? Does anyone know? I'm not going to, just saying. No, it wasn't Petraeus. It was Lieutenant General Barno in April of 2004. If you do a simple Google search, you will see that our commanding generals are doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be doing this public relations aspect of it. They're supposed to be putting on the good face. However, I do not fault them. What I fault is ourselves here, our policymakers, and those charged with oversight, who have failed to take them at their word and continue to and do not continue to question when these assurances of success fall flat. Since 2005, NATO's been expanding throughout Afghanistan. We've been expanding the presence of foreign troops as well as the presence of the Afghan central government. This is not necessarily United States forces, but in the south primarily it was British, Dutch, Canadian. Since that time, we have only seen the increase of conflict, the increase in casualties, the increase in support for the Taliban, and the decrease in support for the Karzai government. One of the things to note is last month, August, wasn't just another monthly high for American casualties. It was the 32nd of 37 months where we've had monthly record high American casualties in Afghanistan. Even in Iraq, where the insurgency took off in late 2003 and the casualty numbers exploded into 2004, they remained at a constant. This trend, and Dr. Pape will elaborate on this trend is consistent in Afghanistan for the last 3 or 4 years since we started expanding the NATO presence. This also now contradicts the assertion that counterinsurgency takes 2 years to work, as been made by the administration this past year. The fact is that where we have placed troops, of course they've entered into combat. Of course they're getting shot out. But the fact is, still there, several years later, they are still being shot at. They have not been accepted. The local population has not embraced either our presence or the presence of a government from Kabul that they see as outsiders. I just want to wrap this up because I want to keep us all to about 5 minutes so that we have plenty of time for Q&A as well as for discussion among the panel. But just want to briefly pass along thoughts I've received from the last couple of days from colleagues and friends. The first is a friend of mine, retired Foreign Service officer up in Maine. He writes for the Free Press up there now. He had the most succinct, and he actually served for 2 years as a Foreign Service officer in Vietnam. He had the most succinct thing I've seen written about this, about where we are in Afghanistan and why we need an alternative strategy, why it's time to move forward with a different approach. And he said, 9 years after 9/11, we have trapped ourselves in a civil war in a corrupt third world country halfway around the world, the outcome of which is not vital to America's national security interests. I think here in D.C. we get wrapped around details and wonkish aspects, and so I think it's important to see how a columnist in MAME phrases our involvement in Afghanistan right now. The other one is from a good friend of mine, one of my best friends, still in the Marine Corps. He went into Helmand Province with the Marines when we first sent the Marines into Helmand Province 2.5 years ago in the spring of 2008. I think a lot of people forget about that. That we've had a U.S. presence, let alone the British presence in Helmand for the last 5 years. We've had a U.S. presence there for 2.5 years now. He did so well as an intelligence officer there. He was the Marine Corps' Intelligence Professional of the Year, so his assessment shouldn't be dismissed. Now he's back, been there a few months. His assessment now, the difference between then and 2.5 years ago in Helmand, we've moved farther north and farther south than the British have, and there are a lot more IEDs. That's his assessment. And that's what I seem to get from a lot of my counterparts. And then finally, the third one I just want to comment briefly on, Afghan American, spoke to him yesterday. He actually fought with the Mujahideen against the Soviets in the 80s, now lives in California, still travels to the region quite often, has a lot of contacts within the Karzai administration as well as within the insurgency. He has worked with our State Department in the past. His frustration was evident last year when he stopped working with them because, according to them, there is no alternative. The only thing we can do is what we're currently doing or do it even more of. And so I think there's a general frustration out there across the spectrum, whether it's people who are actively involved in the conflict or people who are back here in the States whose relationship with the conflict is simply that of reading it in newspapers, seeing it in the media, that we are stuck. It's not getting better. It's getting worse, and that we need to find an alternative. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Steve Cole. Steve, are you online?
I hope so. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. And thanks for the opportunity to participate. Just to start out by echoing Steve Clemens a little bit in, first of all, thanking Paul Pilar, who's worked in the analytical community dating back many years I've chronicled and admire enormously, and everyone else who participated in this project. I notionally run New America, but I didn't participate in this project. I'm nonetheless proud of our contribution to creating the space in which this important work is being brought forward. I recognize I'm on the opposite side of a number of the analytical judgments in the report, and nonetheless think that you've made a very, very important contribution by bringing these arguments and this research forward. The country deserves the kind of debate you're trying to create. It deserves the kind of arguments that you've brought forward. The costs of American engagement in Afghanistan are indeed very high, and the American people deserve a very hard-headed, very active debate about the relationship between those costs in blood and treasure and the security goals that are meant to justify them. So thank you all for your work and for your contribution. I thought I'd use my 4 minutes remaining to, rather than lay out my own analysis, which is available on foreignpolicy.com in the form of an article called The Case for Humility in Afghanistan, which I think thematically echoes a lot of where you're coming from, although ends up perhaps producing a slightly different logic chain about the policy implications, by reminding all of us that the record of outside intervention in Afghanistan over the last 40 years is a very poor one. It's been characterized by repeated failures, and anyone who brings forward a policy plan for creating sustainable peace and stability in Afghanistan, it seems to me, ought to be humbled by that record of repeated failure. It's not just American failure, but Soviet and Pakistani failure as well. I wanted to use my sort of analysis of the analysis to basically first start with the 5-point recommendations, which I think is an enormously valuable contribution. And I would say just very quickly that if you flip forward in your hymnals there in the room to the 5 points, numbers 1, 3, 4, and 5 either are or should be, and maybe are not, compatible with declarative no military solution in Afghanistan. A military victory over the Taliban is unachievable, and it's undesirable to pursue it. What is required is a greater emphasis on the conditions in which sustainable political reconciliation can be created in Afghanistan. And certainly, in some broad stroke sense, emphasizing power sharing and political reconciliation, keeping the focus, certainly for U.S. involvement on that, as well as Al-Qaeda and domestic security, promoting economic development, and pursuing political reconciliation through engagement with global and regional stakeholders. You can't create stability in Afghanistan without engaging global and regional stakeholders. Now, I think this is an important contribution in part because I'm not sure that U.S. policy currently emphasizes those goals adequately or resources them adequately. But they, at least in broad brush, ought to be compatible with the announced strategy. Or a version of it, an amended version of it. Point number 2, to scale back and eventually suspend combat operations in the South and reduce the U.S. military footprint. I would imagine that generated a lot of discussion in your group. I'm not entirely clear what's intended there. The report is silent to my reading of it, by and large, on the question of Afghan security forces and the project of building up the Afghan National Army. And I guess one of the criticisms that I would make of the analytical sort of logic chain in the report is that you might ask whether it sets up a straw man of endless counterinsurgency on the one hand versus this more scaled back approach on the other, in part because there is really no assessment of the plausibility of any Afghan government located in Kabul deploying security forces to defend the Constitution, never mind a specific critique of the plausibility of the current plan, which is to transition to Afghan security forces in the lead in a fixed period of time. Now, that's a separate argument, but I noticed that it wasn't clear to me whether you were recommending that the Afghan army abandon the South or only the United States, or whether you regard the deployment of northern influenced, even northern dominated Afghan security forces in the South as implausible to begin with, and so that they avoid essentially turn the South over to the Taliban. I think that those are issues that ought to be chewed over as you roll this out over the next few weeks. Let me just finish by making one or two other observations about the analysis. I think you've done a terrific job of defining what you believe American national security interests are in the war, interests that have to be weighed against the enormous costs that are being paid to wage that war. And essentially you say that they are the marginalization or the reduction to nuisance level of Al-Qaeda, and also the prevention of a takeover of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal by unfriendly forces. And I think part of what I read you as saying is that you believe that the second goal, as well as the first, that we can feel that those goals are achievable even in the absence of a credible Afghan army willing to contest territory with the Taliban, because you believe that the prospect of the Taliban revolution is that the circumstances that produced it in the 90s are unlikely to be repeated, and that if it occurred, it would essentially be inconsequential to the two security goals that you've outlined. I think that's a very important judgment that you've made. I don't agree with it, but I think it is fundamental to the case that essentially, if the United States changed course, that a Taliban victory or a coercive revolution, which is essentially what occurred in the 90s, would be unlikely to occur, and if it did occur, it would be essentially inconsequential for the vital interests that you've defined. And then finally, I would just chew a little bit on the other analytical framework, which is that this is not a war between a constitutional government and a coercive revolutionary force. It's a civil war in which there are so many layers of complication that it's simply not worthwhile to think of the defense of wonder if it's really not in the end ahistorical to wish that the Taliban are not a coercive revolutionary movement. They define themselves that way, they behave that way. Sometimes they are what they seem to be. In any event, let me just end by returning to the theme that brings us all together, which is the recognition that the stakes here are very, very high, that the costs of failure for the United States are already very high as we struggle to get traction in this conflict. But just also to point out that the history of Afghanistan suggests that whatever policy is attempted, if it fails, there will also be enormous costs for Afghans themselves. The human toll of policy failure in Afghanistan, looking ahead, is likely to be similar to, if not more intense than, the toll that Afghans paid during the 1990s. And I certainly hope that this kind of debate will make it more likely that that sort of failure, catastrophic failure, is avoided. Thanks for letting me participate.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. Next, we'll hear from Charlie Kupchin.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to Steve and the others who pulled together this project. I think this is an extremely important document that appears at an extremely important time. In the spirit of full disclosure, I was part of the study group from the beginning. I chose in the end not to sign the report, so I thought what I would do is give you a sense of how I arrived at that decision, first by outlining where I think the main strengths of the report are, and then touch on a few of my reservations about the analytics of the report as well as its policy conclusions. As far as the strengths go, I think there is one overriding contribution that this report makes, and that is to make a very clear statement of what American interests in Afghanistan are and lay out a very clear argument that the level of U.S. effort in human terms and in economic terms has run far ahead of the interests at stake. And I think the report does a good job of offering one particular presentation of what our interests are. That is to say that al-Qaeda has largely been dismantled in the country, that the number of insurgent combatants that are focused on the far enemy, that is to say us, that would attack the homeland, is very small, and that most of the people that we are fighting in Afghanistan are focused on what would be called the near enemy, that is to say the troops that are in Afghanistan and that are the target of the insurgents because they are there. That is to say, they are seen as foreign occupiers. This is not my judgment. It is not Matt's judgment. It is not Bob's judgment. These are facts which we take from the American intelligence community, and some of the citations in the report will tell you where we get them. But that is an extremely important finding, because it says that when we debate in December or next summer whether we should begin to move out or whether we should ramp it up, there is a very clear argument out there that Afghanistan is not the central front in the war on terror. And that when Obama meets that kind of challenge, and if he decides to draw down, and I hope he does, he will be able to say we are doing this because our interests don't warrant the level of effort that is taking place. I think that the claim that al-Qaeda wouldn't have a chance to return to Afghanistan if the Taliban comes back is perhaps overstated in the report. Here I might agree with Steve Call. I think there are conditions that we need to have in place to make sure that that doesn't happen. I think those conditions are relatively easy for the United States to attain, and I'll come to them in a second. But I do think that this clear specification of our interests and the argument that our effort is now running far ahead of those interests is critical and will play a critical role in shaping the debate. The second major contribution of the report is a very clear statement that the military operation does not offer a solution to the problem in Afghanistan. That the military operation, which has not been going as well as many would like, is a step toward a political settlement. And I think that in the case of Afghanistan, a country in which tribal structures are as fragmented as they are, we simply can't assume that the use of force is going to lead to any kind of stable situation reminiscent of what has taken place in Iraq. And to some extent, I fear we have been misled by Iraq, that we, particularly the American military and the political elite, have discovered the religion of counterinsurgency. And discovering that religion and implementing it in Afghanistan may make sense if it was worth the interests, if in fact there were large al-Qaeda installations that were coming at us, the far enemy. But they are not. And it seems to me that to continue this effort at counterinsurgency in a prolonged and an indefinite manner is simply to continue to move into a deeper and deeper hole. And I think the idea that the United States should, in the end of the day, be the imperial fixer of last resort in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, wherever the next target may be, is a recipe for grinding the American military and the American economy into the ground. And I think Afghanistan is doing a good job of showing us that we need to be very careful about assuming that we can go into very complicated, decentralized countries and put Humpty Dumpty back together again. A third major contribution of the report is, I think, a clear sense that our effort in economic terms, $100 billion a year in a country whose GDP is only $14 billion, is way out of whack at a time in which we have pressing economic challenges at home. We simply don't have the largesse to spend $100 billion in Afghanistan unless the national security interests of the United States warrant it. But as this report makes clear, that national security, that direct security concern suggests that $100 billion in a country of $14 billion is again out of whack. And the final contribution is, I think, the focus on the political side of the equation, the importance of having a sense of not necessarily a completely decentralized Afghanistan, but an Afghanistan where there is a great deal of power decentralized to local forms of civil society and political community that have been there and have been functioning for many, many decades. Let me end by specifying where I think the report falls short to some extent and left me hesitant to sign up to it. The bottom line is, I think that even though I agree with the gist of the report, I think it in places lacks nuance. It lacks sufficient conditionality to drive home some of its points with sufficient persuasion. I think, for example, that the report is somewhat too dismissive of the military effort. It has had some success, it has had some failure, but I think that the military effort is a key stepping stone to the political endpoint. That is to say that if we look at Dayton, what helped us get to a yes in Dayton? The Krajina offensive. The fact that the Serbs were on their heels and they went to the negotiating table. I would make the same argument about Milosevic and Kosovo, about Iraq. Military force is not the end, but it is a means to get a political solution that is more advantageous to us. And so I think that the political endpoint in Afghanistan depends upon us driving the Taliban as much as possible on their heels, thereby getting the best settlement that we can when we go to the negotiating table. I would make a similar argument about the central government and about the Afghan security and police forces. Here I agree with Steve Call. We do need a Kabul that can function. We do need police and an army that can do battle against the Taliban. We do need bases in the country that would allow us to go after al-Qaeda targets if, in fact, al-Qaeda does come back into the country. That requires a much scaled-down American effort, but I think we need to be very clear that this is not, in my mind, should not be a call for withdrawal, and I don't think it is. But it is a call for a level of effort and military engagement wedded to a particular political vision of a stable outcome. The final point, even though Pakistan gets short shrift in the report, I find the treatment of Pakistan so narrow as to be almost enough to knock me from supporting the report. The report says that we have one interest in Pakistan, and that is ensuring the security of its nuclear arsenal. I think Pakistan is an important country in South Asia beyond its nuclear arsenal. The nuclear arsenal, of course, matters. If we weren't as heavily invested in Afghanistan, I think we would have more leverage in Pakistan to help push that country in the right direction. But I am not, as some might call in the academic world, an offshore balancer that believes that we should get out of Afghanistan, get out of Pakistan, get out of Japan, and come back only when war breaks out. I think for countries like Pakistan, precisely because of their size, precisely because of their internal complexity, precisely because of the standoff with India, we have to do much more than stand back and only worry about the integrity of their nuclear weapons, in part because the integrity of their nuclear weapons depends upon what goes on inside the country, upon ethnic political cleavages, upon the viability of the Afghan government, and that seems to me to be very much in the American interest to stay intimately engaged. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Charlie. Darcy, you're next.
So I was, in the course of putting this report together, a bit of the odd one out on a number of fronts. I am not somebody who spends all day, every day, writing policy. I, in fact, work with Congress and members of Congress to try to figure out how to actually change things and leverage the power of the American people to impact the direction that the country is going. I am also wearing a very different sort of suit than everyone else. But I found my participation was incredibly valuable to me through all of this. That the group of people who put together this report did a, I thought, fantastic job of genuinely discussing some of the really difficult issues with respect to what the United States should do moving forward in Afghanistan. The core of the problem that we have right now with the debate about Afghanistan in the United States is that it's presented as a false dichotomy. The false dichotomy that is presented is either we have no engagement ongoing and no interests in Afghanistan, or we are engaged militarily for the indefinite future, as though those were the only two possibilities on the table. That demonstrates a distinct lack of imagination. The United States has many more tools at its disposal than just military force. And the report lays out, in the 5 things that it describes we need to do, how the essence of the solution in Afghanistan is fundamentally political. What we're seeing in Afghanistan is a civil war. It's a war over the distribution of power in a country that doesn't have an existing stable distribution of power, in part because we removed all of the existing power sources by force rather some time ago. And that question of distribution of power has to be resolved to bring about stability in Afghanistan. That question is a question that is not fundamentally a military question. It's a political question. And we need to figure out how to engage the political processes in Afghanistan to solve it in order to meet our interests in the country. I've had a bit of a disagreement over the past several weeks with some of my friends who are further on the left than I am, despite Mr. Clemens' characterization of me, who have had a tendency, in my experience lately, to move toward what I would describe as an isolationist stance. To say that we have no interest in Afghanistan, we should simply leave, it doesn't matter what happens, it's none of our business, wash our hands of it and go, which I think is, frankly, deeply misguided. That's what got us into a situation in which al-Qaeda had training camps in Afghanistan. The American people are well aware of that. To wash our hands altogether and say we have no interest in Afghanistan is delusional. But to say that the only thing that we can do is at the point of a gun is incorrect. And that inaccuracy does us a great disservice. The other disagreement that I have been having with my friends on both the left and the right is over the fate of women in Afghanistan. And I think that we need to expressly acknowledge that set of concerns as part of the puzzle here. I cannot tell you how many conversations I have had in the last year with women I know who are afraid to even raise the issue of what happens to the women of Afghanistan in mixed crowds because they get shouted down. We do have an interest in long-term stability in Afghanistan. That interest cannot be met if the women of Afghanistan are uneducated and unfed, if they are dying in childbirth in rates that are truly shocking, if they can't access medical care, if they can't provide for their children, if they have no economic power. We know from all of the research that's been done that as go the women of any country, so goes that country. The more educated they are, the more power they have over their own lives, the more economically empowered they are. The more successful that country is, the better off the children of that country are, the more stability we see. So if what we want is a peaceful, secure, stable Afghanistan in the long term, then we do have to address the issue of what happens to the women of Afghanistan. There are legitimate arguments to be made that an indefinite U.S. military presence is not, in fact, the correct response to how we address the security of women in Afghanistan and their status. That, in fact, things like economic development, micro-lending programs, encouraging the education of children. It turns out, for example, that schools that serve school lunches see families in a country that is as poor as Afghanistan dramatically increase the number of their daughters they send to school, that the prospect of a free lunch in the middle of the day is sufficient to overcome the cultural inhibitions of sending girls to school. It isn't a simple question, but it's one I think we need to address. At its essence, though, I think that the report raises something that absolutely is essential as we discuss what we're going to do in Afghanistan moving forward. It is not the case that the only options that we have are to abandon all of our interests or to stay militarily indefinitely. When we have military planners looking at an 80-year occupation of Afghanistan, we have an enormous problem. A lot of the work that Professor Pape has done in demonstrating the very direct correlation of violence and suicide terrorism to military occupation, all over the world, regardless of who it is that's engaged, shows that our long-term military presence there is probably, frankly, counterproductive. And so I again want to thank the members of this effort and all of the people who were involved for laying out a real alternative, because there is an alternative. We don't have to buy into the false dichotomy. We can make a different choice. And whether or not one thinks that this particular alternative is the ideal, it at least opens the possibility of a discussion of something other than those two options. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Darcy. We'll go to Bob Pape next, and then Brian Catullis. We'll wrap it up, and after that, we will do a response to one another, and then move into questions. So if Bob and Brian can keep us at 5 minutes each.
Sure. Thank you very much. I am very pleased to be part of this report. We all know over the last year that Afghanistan has been heading south. This report helps to explain why. Just to be clear, in the first 6 months of 2010, suicide attacks in Afghanistan have killed 1/3 more people than the same period the year before. If we look at the momentum of the Taliban, remember, the reason we were supposed to surge troops in was to stop the momentum of the Taliban. And let's just even put data in our report aside. Let's turn to the Pentagon's own assessment to Congress. The most recent assessment shows that since December 2009, the Taliban controls more districts, has more popular support than the year before. Clearly, we're having a problem. One of the great virtues of this report is that it's willing to ask the tough questions. We know the Taliban's a religious group. Yes, we know that. We know Afghanistan is a poor country. Yes, we know that. We also know it has a weak central government. Those things have been true for a long period of time. But this has been the most recent crisis in Afghanistan has especially spiked up in the last few years, and this report is willing to ask the tough question. Could it be possible that our current military strategy is part of the problem? Our current military strategy is counterinsurgency, and a way to think about that is that there's sort of an ink spot theory of counterinsurgency. The idea is that you kind of put some forces in, and if you can kind of just grow that area like an ink spot, you'll get more stability, more stability, more stability. Well, if that theory were right, we should be seeing a lot of stability in Afghanistan at this point, because the fact of the matter is, over the last few years, we have been growing that ink spot at 30,000 troops a year over the last 4 years. So that ink spot has been growing. Stability has not. Now, as you've heard before, I spend a lot of my life studying suicide attacks. My project is the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism. We have what we think of as the best searchable database on suicide attacks there is. If you go to our website, you can find not just the data, but you can drill down and see all the actual sources. And I don't just mean citations, the actual hard text of the sources of the data. So you'll have a lot of confidence in what we're saying. But if you look at that data, you will see that since 1980, there have been nearly 2,200 suicide attacks around the world. 95% have been directly in response to foreign occupation, not 100%, but 95%. Let's look at Afghanistan. Afghanistan's a prime example of this particular argument. Before 2001, when we go in, not a single suicide attack in Afghanistan. From 2001 to 2005, there's actually just a handful, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then in 2006, an explosion of suicide attacks in Afghanistan, about 100 a year. And it stays that level from till now, 2010, 3.5 years later. That is, we go from about a dozen to 350 suicide attacks. What happened in 2006? Did suddenly Afghanistan become poorer? No. Did suddenly the Taliban become more religious? No. Did Karzai suddenly become more corrupt? Well, actually, look, he has been pretty corrupt from the beginning. We put him in because the CIA picked him to ... So the bottom line is none of those features changed in 2006. What really changed? Well, the key thing you need to know is that for the first few years of our presence in Afghanistan, we had a very few number of troops, and we were only occupying Kabul. Basically, we had a few thousand troops in the capital city protecting Karzai so he wouldn't be assassinated. Then, in October 2003, the UN gave us a mandate to expand our presence, and ISAF, that's the International Security Forces, came up with a brilliant plan over a period of years. First year, go north. Remember the Northern Alliance, our friends? Our friends. Next, we go to the west, more friends. Then starting in early 2006, where do we start deploying our troops? To the south and to the east, the Pashtun homeland. And that's when suicide attacks explode. And moreover, when you look at who's doing the suicide attacks, we can confidently identify, that is with double verification, the identity of over 93 of the suicide attackers. 90% of them are Afghan nationals. And those Afghan nationals are Pashtuns. This is not some global jihad floating around the world. This is local opposition to American and Western military presence of the Pashtun homeland. And then just look at the other side of the border, just a few miles away in Pakistan. 6 months later, we get an explosion of suicide attacks in Pakistan. 3/4 of those attacks are also in the Pashtun parts of Pakistan. So we are growing anti-American suicide terrorism with this ink spot theory of how to fight counterinsurgency. Now, what do we do? This report does not say we cut and run away. That's not what this report is saying. Not abandoned. When Steve called, I just disagree with his characterization of the report. It's not about walking away. This is also not about just staying the course. And let's just keep growing the ink spot theory, because this is producing more terrorists than it's killing. And they're anti-American terrorists. This is not a healthy thing to have happen. Rather, what the report calls for is a middle ground course I have my own favorite term for it. I call it offshore balancing, but I don't quite mean what Charlie seems to think I mean by that, which is I don't just mean we kind of become isolationists and only go back. No, I think we rely on air forces, naval forces, and then economic and political tools to empower local allies so that we can work together, not abandon a region, but work together with a militarily more effective course of action. By the way, this is exactly the policy that folks like me called for in 2005 in Iraq. We heard the same arguments in Iraq, that if we did this in Iraq, basically Iraq would collapse, we'd have the rise of the Al-Qaeda. What have we done in Iraq? We've pursued this exact policy. Suicide attacks in Iraq is down over 85% in the last 3 years. That's what we're calling for here in Afghanistan, and I, for one, am just very pleased to be a member of this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And Brian, please.
Great. Thanks, Matt. I'm Brian Catoulis with the Center for American Progress again, and I'm grateful actually to get in just before 1 o'clock because at 1, everybody's on TV land is going to be switching over to Steve Clemens over at MSNBC because it's such a rare opportunity to see him on TV. I do want to just use my 5 minutes to offer what are my constructive critiques, because I disagree with much of this report, even though I was part of the process, and I shared my disagreements at various stages of various drafts. But before I do that, I want to share an anecdote with you, because I got a flurry of emails yesterday and phone calls from people who saw my name on the invite for this event, and they thought I actually had signed this report. And I'm not going to name names here, but they were irritated. They were aghast. They couldn't believe the report was saying this, and it was saying that. And I want to say that's a good thing. Getting that sort of reaction is an important thing, because I think far too often the conventional wisdom is not challenged here. And I think when you look at the foreign policy establishment and its batting average, actually on national security questions, you do a careful look at that. They would have been sent to the minors many, many years ago. And having a debate is very important. It's actually very hard. I have to talk to my colleagues at CAP that work on econ or domestic policy issue. But I actually think it's very hard with some of the security analysts to engage in a real debate where there's an open-minded sort of discussion. And I hope my comments are taken in that vein. I think this report does many things that are correct and right. It offers a new perspective on the relative costs and the benefits of the current approach. And it tells us and raises this question, are we keeping Americans safer? It tackles some key myths at the very end of the report. You should take a look at that, which I hope will spark a debate and perhaps even a counterinsurgency here at home. So General Petraeus, if you're watching, and I'm sure you are, there is a debate here at home, and it needs to be had and it needs to be responded to. So I think it's an important contribution to spark that debate and to shake things up. And I hope this is the first of many events that we can have to talk about it. That all said, it's my judgment, and this is the reason why I didn't sign it, the weaknesses of the report currently outweigh the contributions it makes. And my overall reaction to the final draft was that it was a report, and with all due respect to everybody who signed on, it's a report with an identity crisis. It's not certain whether it wants to offer political talking points to people to open up the debate to a broader audience, which I think is an important thing to do, or to offer an alternative policy idea. It kind of does both, and I think it kind of does both of those tasks ineffectively and could be better. And I know there'll be various iterations, and I hope this is the continuation of a discussion. I had 5 main things, main criticisms, 3 on a policy basis, and then 2 on the political debate back home here. And I think it's very important because this is, by its nature, a political document, and I'll be very brief. Number 1, I think the report suffers from a bit of wishful thinking about political reconciliation in Afghanistan. I say that recognizing, and I do believe that political reconciliation and power sharing is fundamental to the task. So I'm not opposed to that, and I don't subscribe to this notion that you can simply just use military means to address these power sharing differences. But I think when you look at the enormity of the challenge there, and you look at the stated positions of certain parts of the Taliban insurgency, I think it's very difficult to map out what that political process looks like, and this report doesn't do it. Number two, it's Charlie mentioned this. The sections on the regional dimensions are underdeveloped, and I think we all need to think more concretely about this. Carnegie has an interesting new monograph that tries to tackle this. And in the work that I did on Iraq when I lived in the Middle East, and we talked about the regional dimension. I actually think in Afghanistan it is much more important to get the regional dimensions correct than it is in Iraq for some basic facts. Afghanistan being a landlocked country, and even if it has many minerals, you need the cooperation of countries that border Afghanistan to get it right. I'm not certain that this current draft actually scratches that itch in the right way. And then the last substantive policy critique is that I just didn't understand the schedule for reducing the footprint. 68,000 troops October 2011, 30,000 July 2012. I didn't understand the rationale behind that, what those troops would be doing, the gap that I think Steve Cole mentioned in terms of training the security forces in Afghanistan. And related to that, I support the instinct of stronger economic development in Afghanistan, but I don't know how you do both. How do you effectuate a pretty large withdrawal? And don't conclude that I'm saying that I think our military should be doing development assistance. It's just how do you protect NGOs? So those three policy concerns I had. But the last two on the political, and I think if you take away, because I think this is important for the point about the debate here at home that Darcy mentioned and others have too. I think the report does not address what I think is a very important feature to how we conduct warfare today as a country and how we can decide when wars end. And then the one thing it doesn't talk about are sunk costs. It talks about the substantial costs today. And I hope I'm clear about this, but I think for a whole range of political reasons, the 9 years of investment, and this is not my own personal view, but I think this is how we are as an electorate and as a country. We need to feel like we've done something good in a particular place. We need to say, this was worth it. And this venture was worth it. And because the three policy pieces that I think are missing don't add up to a package that I think is compelling or coherent, I worry that it doesn't bring Afghanistan to a state where Americans can say, we've checked that box in the way that we have in Iraq. The surge has worked. 60% of the American public believes that to be true. And we need to tell ourselves that, notwithstanding the situations in countries like Iraq today and how difficult it is. And the second political challenge, which I think addresses some of the issues that Bob Pape's data, I think, is tremendous and it's important. But I think part of the reason, and we discussed this a few months back, why it's not being absorbed by people who are in the field, who are taking this on board. Like,
I guess I disagree with that a little bit, Brian, since there's like 100,000 copies of the book. I mean, there's just
no. What I'm saying, it's not being implemented. It's not being implemented in terms of policy. Okay. Yeah, it's out there in the debate, but it's not leading to change in policy. If we've tripled the number of troops in Afghanistan, I think you can't disagree that conclusion's not been absorbed. And I think part of it isn't that the data is wrong. It goes back to this notion of national pride and honor. And it's hard for us to understand, I think, as a country. The point that I think you've got right is that we're seen as foreign occupiers because we as a country see our troops as doing very good, and they do. We train them to do a tremendous job. Psychologically, politically, it's hard for us to recognize that as a fact, that perhaps we're doing more harm than good. And notwithstanding what data points say, I think it's very hard as a political dynamic to punch through with data. And when I say it's not being absorbed, it's so obviously not being absorbed if you look at the behavior and the decisions that are made. Your argument is out there. That all said, I think in conclusion, I think this is an important report to spark this debate. When I talk to people in the government, at the White House and other things, I think the things that they might be looking for, a couple of things. One, more data on what is actually happening on the ground in Afghanistan. And I know people who are preparing for the next round of the reviews. Actually, even there's an irony. We have more people on the ground in Afghanistan, but we may know less objectively about how we're doing on key elements of building institutions and objectively measuring how we're doing in that regard. Second, what are our leverage points with Afghan leaders? And I think this is the toughest nut to crack. I've talked about it quite a lot. But if we are going to leave something sustainable behind, how does the mix of what we propose to advance U.S. national security interests get our partners in Afghanistan to do what we want them to do? If you look at the front page of the New York Times today and the story of the Kabul bank and the corruption issues, I think that's a very big challenge. And I think the last thing, 3 days before the 9/11 anniversary, and I think Paul noted this, but in a more macro sense, in a global sense, how do we know whether we're keeping Americans safe from that threat that attacked us on 9/11? 9 years later, we've spent more than $1 trillion. And I know some parts of the government are looking holistically at the global balance. And I think this report suggests that we're out of balance and overinvested in Afghanistan to the detriment of other places and to the detriment of our economy here at home. But we still don't, 9 years into this, whatever we call it now, no longer the war on terror, still don't have clean and clear enough objective metrics that help us understand where to place our assets to keep Americans safe. So I look forward to the discussion, and thanks for inviting me.
All right, thanks, Brian. Appreciate you being here, particularly since you just had a baby boy, you and your wife.
Yes.
And today's your anniversary, right?
Yes.
So thank you for coming here. Okay, what I'd like to do next is I'd like to respond, have each of us respond to some of the criticism. Do we still have Steve Cole on the line? I don't think we have Steve anymore. Okay, so Paul, if you'd like to respond to some of Steve's comments, and Steve can't defend himself, and then I'll respond to a little bit what Charlie said, and Charlie follow up on that, and then if Darcy and Bob want to respond to Brian's comments, and then Brian can respond as well, and if we can all try and keep this just to 1 minute or two each, so that we have plenty of time for questions from the audience here. So, Paul, if you'd like to begin, please.
Well, just very briefly, 2 points. One, not just Steve Cole, but also Brian and Charlie very correctly noted areas where the report is thin, doesn't go into things in greater depth. I suppose the justification for the report writers is if they did all that stuff, you'd have a report this thick and no one would get beyond the first 2% of it. If some of the other topics did go, if it did address them in greater depth, like Pakistan, and I agree with Charlie that it's looked at rather narrowly, I think some of the same doubts about the current course of action could be raised. We tend to look at these adjacent countries like that in a kind of paint oozing over the border imagery like we used to do with the red paint during the Cold War, and that's simply not the way it works. And if we were to zero base South Asian policy today, with our prime concern being those proverbial Pakistani nuclear weapons, our main instrument for keeping them out of nasty hands would not be a counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. And quickly, my second point, and this is really more kind of addresses something that Brian said when he mentioned wishful thinking about political reconciliation. We've all said what a difficult situation this is. Nobody's got a good solution that isn't very vulnerable to all kinds of criticisms, and that would be an example of the kind of point where you always have to ask the follow-on question, okay, what's the alternative, and is the alternative any better? And I would suggest the current course of action, pursuing the counterinsurgency, is not necessarily any better at dealing with the challenge of political reconciliation. It's just a question of we'd still have that problem after incurring a lot more costs and casualties.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I'd like to say about the report as well as that it was not meant to be an actual strategy or plan in the sense of something that the president could execute on. In fact, one of the things I've been arguing for the last several months or last year is that the president does not actually have an option or a plan to utilize that is not one presented to him by the Pentagon and the State Department. I imagine last year when General McChrystal came in with course of action A, course of action B, course of action C, and could point out and say, Mr. President, if you approve this, 5.2 Stryker will go here, 2nd Med will go in here, we're going to spend $25 million in irrigation projects here. There was no alternative. I was not in the room, but I imagine that the Vice President's counterterror proposal was probably no deeper than this piece of paper. So the argument we're making here is that what we are currently doing, what we've been currently doing for several years, is not just failing but counterproductive, and we have to provide the Oval Office with another alternative. So that spring, summer 2011, when the president is making a decision on his on what he should do with respect to Afghanistan, he has another option. One or two things that Charlie said, just to respond. Too dismissive of the military effort and too dismissive of Kabul. And I agree with Paul regarding Pakistan. I think with respect to what we said about Pakistan report, I think we define it as vital interest. So then it comes down to what is your definition of vital interest. In my case, it's do we have American forces killing and being killed? That's a vital interest. And I see, do we need that in that area? Is that what's the benefit of our forces doing that? And that's what comes down to vital interests. But with regards to particularly the Kabul government and the Afghan security forces, I certainly see a role for that. I believe that the traditional forms of governance in Afghanistan have traditionally been much more local, oftentimes valley or village-based. I'm not saying we should dictate how the Afghan government should look like, but that's ultimately for the Afghans to do. However, we can see that in the current structure of the government, the current structure of security forces, it heavily weighs one side against the other. You see that particularly in security forces in the East and particularly in the South, security forces that are dominated by Afghans who do not come from the rural Pashtun communities. They are viewed as outsiders. They are viewed as, with regards to the Afghan central government, they are viewed as carpetbaggers. And I see a lot of similarity to mistakes we made in Iraq in 2003 to 2006 when we populated the Sunni areas along the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys with Shia-dominated Iraqi National Guard and then Iraqi army units that excluded and disenfranchised the Sunnis and drove them to insurgency. So quite a bit what I see a role for an Afghan government, a role for an Afghan central government, probably not as strong as what they have now. For one thing, I don't think they can sustain it. There's not the capacity to do so. But the other thing being that it needs to be a much more inclusive organization. It must not be an organization that disenfranchises or excludes one ethnic group from another, as I believe it currently does. So, Charlie?
I want to respond to you, Matt, but also pick up on a point that Brian made, because I think it's political, very important to discuss the kind of political context in which this report comes out and I think is targeted at. And that is, I think you're right, Brian, that this whole question of sunk costs, of the psychological commitment of wanting to feel that we've done well in Afghanistan is something that biases the debate to do more. That whenever we get to a decision point, whether it's in Iraq or in Afghanistan, the political cycle is always, well, if we haven't done well thus far, let's just put our pedal to the metal and increase the effort. And I think that's the danger that we face. And I don't want to speak for other members of the group, but I think one of the things that united many of us, even those who did not sign the report, is to try to create a credible plan for containing the level of U.S. effort and to give Obama and those around him a roadmap for a plan B that is not that is based upon a credible, hard-headed analysis of the interests at stake and the options before the United States. And I think that despite the thinness of the report in certain places, I think the report does offer that roadmap, and it's an important inoculation against, especially in a particularly partisan Washington, the tendency for these decision nodes to always end up with doing more rather than doing less. And I speak for myself when I say I think that would be a grievous mistake if we hit this next decision node and end up doing more. And that's partly because I think one of the lessons I take away from our effort in Afghanistan thus far and our effort in Iraq is that we need to be very humble about just how much our overwhelming military force gets us, about how effectively we can use our military force to get to effect the political outcome that we want. And so I would agree with Brian that we don't know exactly what a political solution would look like. We don't know how easy it's going to be to get 80% of the Taliban to strike a deal with Karzai and other elements within Afghanistan. But to some extent, that's the only choice we have. To some extent, we have to say we might not get exactly the solution that we want. We might end up with a government that doesn't provide women as much protection and as much rights as Darcy and I and others might want. But I also think we need to be realistic about the limits of American power, lower our sights, aim for those lower sights, and achieve them, rather than having objectives that we will continuously chase after and never come close to achieving.
Okay, Darcy.
So one of the persistent critiques of the report amounts to its brevity. And I actually want to push back a little bit on that. As someone who would very much like to see a greater percentage of the American public engaged in the discussion, the fact that this report is digestible by the average American, that it tells the story of what is happening in Afghanistan and why and what the alternatives are, and it does so clearly, is a strength and not a weakness of the report. It is not a typical DC think tank document. Absolutely it's not. It would have to be 18 times as long and way less comprehensible to be a typical DC think tank document. But it isn't designed to be that. We have those coming out our ears. What we have needed and lacked was a clear telling of the story of what's going on in Afghanistan and what the alternatives are, that the American public could understand. And this document, for the first time, gives us that.
I do want to say a word, but I don't want to get into the personality and the personal side of this. But I want to talk a little bit about the issue of, okay, let's assume there's actually a consensus on the facts among the experts. A consensus on the facts. Should we then look at the current political atmosphere, which might run against that consensus, and then not pursue the natural course of the facts? Is that really the way to go? Whether it's, you call it pride or however you want to frame it, that's a choice that we have. Well, I just want to point out that a few years ago, there were political leaders who had an even bigger dilemma than we face today. The Iraq War was supported by 70% of the American public in 2003. And there were political leaders at the time who, despite that, saw the facts and actually became the consensus facts and went and opposed the war and developed a whole new set of policies, and the leader of that movement is now the President of the United States. And so I don't think that just because there's a divergence between the consensus and the facts and the political atmosphere, that means just go where the politics goes. I think that's just not proven to be the politically winning solution. Now, of course, I'm a professor at the University of Chicago. I don't run for elections, okay? But I did just watch the leader of the opposition to the Iraq War run in the face of a much greater public opposition and not just become president, but stabilize that country. So I think that there's a good case to be made for at least discussing the policies that come from the consensus of the facts.
Yeah. Okay.
I fundamentally agree with all that. And that's, don't be unclear about what I was saying. When I said sunk costs, I'm not saying that's a reason to stay. My personal view is that's the dumbest, stupidest reason to stay. But it is a dynamic that we as analysts at think tanks or academics in the university don't have the luxury. We have the luxury to ignore, and unfortunately, having been engaged in this, and I see, this beast of how policy is made, these notions of sunk costs or national pride. I'm not saying go where the politics go. I was an early supporter of Barack Obama, and in fact, was a co-author of a report in 2005 that argued for a timeline, and have been recently vilified for having been wrong on Iraq. It's amazing to me. My point is this, is that it's not enough to have the best ideas in a short or long report in a think tank. And my big worry today is that we don't debate national security in the broad sense. There's a strategic shielding of the American public. We don't feel the costs. I think 40 to 50 million people have a direct personal connection with family serving in Afghanistan or in Iraq. We're running these wars on borrowed money. and we don't have enough leaders on Capitol Hill. And that's why I think this report is important. I disagree with some of the analytical judgments, and the 2 points on sunk costs and the national pride, I don't think it scratches that itch just yet. That's what I was posing, was a challenge for what's the next draft of the report? What's the next event that you do? What's the next briefing that Matt Ho does? When you want to get to change, it's not enough to put ink on paper. That's an important starting point in putting ideas, and this is an important starting point for this process. But what I'm saying is it's not nearly enough. And you're probably, if you look at the history of the United States, it's damned hard to get out of wars for those last two reasons. And facts be damned about whether it keeps Americans safe or not. And that's my point.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, with Brian's comments on the debate aspect of this, that's what we'd like to see. We want to make sure there's a serious discussion going on in these next several months about this war. And in terms of people who are interested in the Afghanistan study group, our reports, whether you agree with it in total, whether you agree with it only in parts, we would like others' involvement. If you feel that the policy we have right now is, whether it's failing, counterproductive, whether you think it just needs to be tweaked a bit, I'm basically saying as long as you're not advocating for, if you're advocating for a change or a review of the policy, and as long as that change doesn't involve, say, dropping an atom bomb on Kandahar, we want you in this tent. We want to be as inclusive and as big tent approach as possible, because what we want to do is build a consensus so that come the seating of the next Congress, there is that political support out there to re-examine the strategy and to offer an alternative. So with that, I'd like to begin the questions. Where's Andrew? I have to go first with my friend Colonel Tony Sinnott over there. So please, Tony.
Thanks a lot.
And may I ask, please keep this to questions and not statements.
All right. Matt, you know I'm going to have a hard time doing that.
That's exactly why I said that, Tony.
Simplify, brother. It's been a long time. All right. For the panelists, I do have questions rather than a statement. I'm the S5 with 4th Civil Affairs Group, Plans and Policy. We have people in Afghanistan now, and we will be sending more there in the coming weeks for new rotation. So I have a vested interest in this topic, both personally and professionally. But moving down some of the basic points in your report and the discussions here, with regard to reconciliation, I wonder, with regard to that versus competence and capacity and governmental structures, will the Afghan government have institutional competence at the central government level, or the structures necessary to create any kind of enduring balance of power? You talk about the structures that are there now, giving a lot of arbitrary power at the center, which leaves it up to arbitrary policy formation, which is temporal, can change at any given time, without a constitutional apparatus to create a balance of power between the provinces and the center. Will that ever be able to come about in the time that we have troops there, 2011, 2012? Next part, with security, how ready would you say the government of Afghanistan would be to independently fund and administer both security and economic affairs as we move toward 2011, 2012? With regard to economy specifically, with the GNP, as you've noted, of only $14 billion annually, and we're spending $100 billion a year presently on institutional development, mainly in security. I presume that's for 2009 in your report. How robust will the legitimate agricultural and commercial trade sectors be to generate the tax revenues sufficient to self-fund government operations in any part of that security apparatus that we are building? And then, furthermore, with regard to self-sufficiently, in a general statement, how long do you anticipate the country of Afghanistan will be a client state of NATO and principally the U.S., it looks like?
Okay. My brief thoughts on all that. It seems you hit a lot on the capacity or lack thereof, and it does not possess those, not just institutions but individuals. I mean, you're talking about a country when you get out to where the insurgency is being waged with literacy rates of less than 10%, and actual serious innumeracy problems. We were capped at about, in the province I was in, about spending $20 million, $25 million in military construction spending reconstruction spending, because there just wasn't that capacity within the Afghan economy to absorb anymore. So my take on this, a quick answer to get through all that, is that you won't have any growth in capacity, you won't have any growth, any successful development work until you achieve some degree of political stability. So until you address the underlying root political causes of a conflict, and for me this conflict goes back 30, 35 years. It's been a civil war in one shape or another, various sides on different sides at times. But until you address those political issues, until you reach some degree of political accord where you bring in those groups that are now supporting the Taliban because they feel excluded from the government, you will not have the stability necessary to achieve any of the things you said. As far as how long it will be a client state of NATO, the industry there is just it's non-existent. The only industry that has a value chain of any sort, that from credit to purchase fertilizer up to a ready available market, is the opium trade, the poppy trade. There is nothing else. I mean, you cannot grow crops there because there's no roads to get the crops out. If you had the roads, there's no electricity to run the cold storage facilities. It's a monumental process that it will take to bring this country out of the bottom 2 or 3 of the world. But you need political stability first. And I want to go to Charlie and then Bob Pape, please.
I'd just like to add a quick comment to the question. I think you touched on some critical issues. I would like to suggest that the nature of the question perhaps needs to be flipped around, and that one of the messages of this report would be that instead of saying, when will we have the security forces, when will we have the central government, when can we cut Afghan loose as a client state, I would sort of put the question in this way. The United States needs to contain the level of its effort in Afghanistan because its commitment is running ahead of its interests, because our economy needs help. We are running huge deficits, and every aspect of the budget needs to get whacked, including the defense budget. That having been said, we know we need to downsize in Afghanistan. What can we do on all those important dimensions that you suggest to get the best outcome we can? What can we do to do the best on the security forces, the best on political reconciliation? And I would put the sort of chain of causation that way, rather than letting those benchmarks be the determinant of our strategy and the level of our effort.
There's a key issue with the Afghan Constitution, the one that we put in 2004, that bears directly on this. Most Americans know that in 2004 we wrote, and then the Afghans voted on it, a new constitution for Afghanistan that's democratic, that has national elections. What most Americans, however, don't know is that there's a special feature of that democratic constitution, which centralizes all power in the presidency, in the president of the country, to appoint the provincial governors and the district governors. No check and balance, nothing like that at all, just simply appointment. Well, give you an example. Right now, just yesterday, Mayor Daley in Chicago, I'm from Chicago, announced he's stepping down. So this would be like Obama picking the next mayor of Chicago, and the people of Chicago having, and maybe we're about to find out if we have the capacity to do that. But my point is, you can see immediately that all the talk about, well, let's build the Afghan capacity, let's build the tax system, let's build. For what? The Afghan people, I don't think there's a degree of capacity we could possibly build that is going to allow a president in any system to have that kind of power, much less in Afghanistan, which has been bottom up, not top down, for almost all of its history. So this is a central problem. So I think that we need to recognize that if we want to get into the business of true nation-building micromanagement, this isn't about throwing money at Afghan security forces. That's the trivial part of the problem. We do that very well. The problem is we're very bad at actually trying to figure out those kind of constitutional issues. We tried it. We wrote it for them. They voted on it. And it's not working very well. What we need to do is have a decentralized approach.
Okay, Andrew, up here in the front.
Thank you. I'm Wayne Murray, the American Foreign Policy Council. I'd like panel members to address the viability of the multinational aspect of this enterprise. It's certainly no secret that in most of the participating countries, it is extremely unpopular. Two of the countries whose troops have actually done their share of the dirty work, the Dutch and the Canadians, have pulled out. Many of the other European governments are starting to look at the prospect of an American drawdown, perhaps a year from now, as essentially an excuse for a race to the exit. But more to the point, in most European countries at least, this war is seen as something that the Americans imposed on them because the Americans wanted auxiliaries in this enterprise. So when bodies go home to these countries, we get blamed for it. Though in many of the cases, the governments, I think, are much more motivated to keep people in Afghanistan in order to get traction with Washington on other issues. For example, the Georgian president sent a major contingent to Afghanistan so that Washington would be under obligation to him. So my question is, how viable is this enterprise as a multinational one, a NATO enterprise, in the years ahead, and what are the secondary costs the United States pays for that?
Paul, Brian?
I'd just say I think you've summarized in your question very well one of the secondary costs, and it's a significant one, and I agree with your observation.
Yeah, I was in Europe the night President Obama gave his address at West Point, and I was actually at the midpoint between the United States and Kabul on the planet, and I felt like I could have been on the moon because Afghanistan really didn't animate the debate in Europe. I mean, there's some opposition, but it's kind of a low-grade fever. It's not like Iraq. It's out there. It's kind of a little like here, but I think people have lost sense of what the objective is and what the end goal is, and more without some sort of sense of what the clear end state is, and then how do you achieve some sense of progress. You're going to continue to see, as we did in Iraq, the coalition getting smaller and smaller, and there needs to be some sort of clarifying moment if the goal is to prevent that. But the goal should be ultimately, how do we keep, it's not just about U.S. national security, but how do we keep the world secure and make sure that this is seen as in the interest of these other countries. And right now, the best arguments that I hear in testimony or from my friends in the administration is we don't want another 9/11, and it's framed in the negative. And unless it's framed much more in the positive, and this is how we're going to get there, we're not going to be able to. That process will continue, is my prediction, and then that raises bigger questions about the viability of NATO and transatlantic relations.
Gentleman in the third row with the blue shirt, please.
I'm Ray McGovern with Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. I'm taken with the fact that there are no alternatives. It was mentioned that General McChrystal had 3 alternatives. No one else had any. I used to work in the intelligence community where no president, from Kennedy to George Bush I, would make a critical decision without ordering what we called a national intelligence estimate. Paul has chaired more of them than I. My question is, why was there no national intelligence estimate this time last year on Afghanistan? And why is there no national intelligence estimate this year on Afghanistan?
Paul?
Ray, intelligence isn't going to answer these difficult questions that we've been mulling over the last hour and a half. The most difficult issues that have been appropriately raised, everything from how to reconcile to the status of the Afghan security forces, are a big, difficult, open book for the most part. So I think you've got the wrong mechanism there. I would commend the administration for what seemed to be, from the outside, a very thorough process that led up to the last iteration of U.S. policy, the long review for which President Obama got unjustly criticized by the political opposition for dithering, but it did seem to be pretty thorough. And that was a remarkable, refreshing contrast to the last previous war where we had no policy process at all.
It was wrong.
What we arrived at, or what the administration arrived at in the President's West Point speech, was a political compromise that reflects some of the political realities that people like Charlie and Brian have commented on, that coupled the idea of a surge, which, as mentioned, had acquired a certain positive cachet in Iraq, with the idea of withdrawal starting next July. And if you do the math in terms of number of months, it doesn't add up at all in terms of what the counterinsurgency experts like General Petraeus would tell us is necessary to do the job. It was a political compromise. So in that sense, yes, it was wrong.
Okay, in the second row here in the gray shirt, please.
Since you said political reconciliation is a very significant element of your report, what do you think about the High Council of Peace, which Karzai announced over the weekend? Do you think it's going to be effective? I'm Ravi Khanna, VOA Television. I wanted to know the effectiveness of the Karzai's High Council for Peace, which he announced over the weekend, seeing the ethnic differences.
You're looking at me. I mean, again, I'm not a co-author in the report, but my own view, and it's something. But Bob made an important point about the power sharing arrangements that are embedded in the Constitution right now, and I think this report notes it. I think it's very difficult to get from here to there without having some fundamental reassessment of what has been put into place. So when I was saying in my concluding remarks, how do we shape the calculations of actors like Karzai and others, that's been a tough nut to crack. I don't have much optimism about what Karzai has announced right now because I don't know how far it goes to try to restructure the overall internal power dynamics. But that should be a big part of it. I mean, when I came back from Afghanistan last year, I was very frustrated because the question posed to me in the media was, right, do you want more troops or do you want less? And that's a key element. I'm not saying it's unimportant, but the reason why I think this report is very important is that understanding power and the nature of power in societies like Afghanistan, we actually approach it from a very American and I think a very militarized standpoint. And I'm not saying that those elements aren't important, but sometimes we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And these, there may be hope in what Karzai announced if it actually looks to fundamentally reassess how do you share power in that society. And given what I've seen this year on just the tactical decisions made on the elections that will be held a week from Saturday, or how he's tried to deal with the corruption issues, I remain deeply concerned about whether or not we have a partner in Kabul in these ventures.
We had some reporting just a couple of days ago when I wrote a piece on it about the unfortunate falling into disuse of the mechanism they already have for reconciliation with individual Taliban. And unfortunately, the biggest barrier to how it's worked so far is this ethnic business, the resentment by non-Pashtuns of doing anything nice to Pashtuns. And that will probably continue to be a problem no matter whom Karzai appoints to the body.
We're going to go to the back, but my comments briefly on it is that this is why the U.S. needs to play a lead role in these efforts. There was a New York Times report a couple weeks ago that confirmed what a lot of us thought about the capture of Mullah Baradar, who was number 2 Taliban last February by the Pakistani intelligence service. The Pakistanis are now saying that, and like I said, many of us believe this, that they did it to spike the peace process. I can tell you my work with the embassy over there, we were hands off any reconciliation efforts, and I don't believe that has changed whatsoever. I actually had a story I don't think I've told publicly. Last May 2009, I was in Jalalabad. We were contacted by a rep from Hezbollah Islami, which is the second largest insurgent group in Afghanistan, saying, hey, we want to come in and talk. My response back from the embassy was, leave it alone. Then 10 months later, Hezbollah Islami goes to Kabul with a 15-point peace plan. So there has to be much firmer efforts by the United States government at both internal Afghanistan, internally to Afghanistan, as well as externally to Afghanistan to lead these efforts. We're the ones with the leverage in the region. We're the ones with the troops, with the money, with the clout. We should be the ones who are able to tell the other nations in that region, it's in your best interest to have a negotiated settlement to only get 70% of what you want in Afghanistan, as opposed to continue this proxy war for another several decades. So that's my views on where we're at with this piece. But I need to go to the back, so plenty of people back there behind the cameras.
Good afternoon. Andrea Prasso, Human Rights Watch. I'd like to thank Darcy for mentioning the plight of the women in Afghanistan, although I'm disappointed that none of the men on the panel mentioned women, and that I think there are only 2 very brief references to women in the report. So I'd like to ask what sort of analysis you did, what documents you looked at, whether you conducted any interviews in coming to your conclusions. I'll cite the Human Rights Watch report that came out in July about the plight of women in Afghanistan in areas where the Taliban do control right now, and the really serious consequences that these women face. It's very difficult to get a microloan if you're not allowed to leave your house. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about why there isn't more mention of women in the report, and also your views about the role that women and children play in analyzing whether or not there is any success in Afghanistan.
Okay, Darcy, you want to go first?
We debated this actually a fair amount when we were discussing what we should include depth or any depth with in the report, and what we didn't have room for. I certainly was the strongest advocate for addressing the plight of women in Afghanistan more, to the point that I'm pretty sure Steve Clemens eventually found me annoying. It is a significant issue. It is one that is not easy to solve, and there was a real effort made to talk in the report about the specific recommendations where there was an opportunity to impact the women of Afghanistan, though again not a lot of depth went into it. I suspect, to be honest, that one of the next stages of this process is going to have to be a much more thorough look at how we address the issue of women in Afghanistan. And that's necessary not just because it's the right thing to do, but because if we're going to build a political coalition in this country to change our course in Afghanistan, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to do that without women who by and large in this country have seen the Time cover, have read 3 Cups of Tea, which was one of the most popular book club books in the country, have seen all of the articles from very early on about how women post the war for the first times were able to get medical care, get education, leave their houses, and who are not willing to walk away from the commitment that we've made. There isn't enough here. We're going to have to take it a step further.
Bob, do you want to follow up?
You're quite right that we don't address the issue enough, and I wish that we did, because I think there's actually quite a bit more to say, which is that I definitely think that the issue of women in Afghanistan is important, but I also think it gets used to justify that ink spot theory of how to wage war in Afghanistan, and I also think that that's doing more harm than good, because it's helping to spread the Taliban control areas, which are causing the deep plight in your report. It's not that I think we should have spent more time. Honestly, we should have. There's also, outside of the Taliban areas, since that gets most of the attention, we're not spending enough in the safer parts of the country to educate women. You see what I mean? So I definitely think that we should have done more in that area, but I also strongly think that the policies we're suggesting are actually serving that interest.
Okay. Andrew, you want to find someone else back there for us, please?
Hi, my name is Debbie Smith. I actually run an education nonprofit. I'm building a school for children with special needs in Kabul. I'd actually like to follow up on her question, because I just don't think you effectively answered it. I don't see how we can create political reconciliation in Afghanistan and, much larger, answer effectively the interests of women without creating a more secure environment and beating back the Taliban. Can you guys address that maybe a little further?
Sure. My view on it is this. Where I was in southern Afghanistan, we were in a city of about 30,000 people, Pashtun, we had about a couple thousand Afghan security forces there and at least 1,000 coalition security forces there. The women were treated the same way there as they were treated in the Taliban regime in the 90s and the way they were treated in the Taliban and before that. It's a cultural issue within the raw Pashtun population, one that we're not going to solve with men with rifles. I think the overwhelming concern for most women in the Pashtun belt right now is the fact that they are in the midst of a war and that bombs are being dropped near their homes and they can't travel on the roads because of IEDs. My recommendation is find a way to stop the conflict first. And if you do not have what we would like to see in terms of satisfactory goals for women's rights right away, that is something we can work to over 5 to 10 years. But until we stop the conflict, until you bring about some form of reconciliation, until you give those local groups reasons not to ally themselves underneath the banner of the Taliban and to come into some type of power and sharing agreement or to be included in the governing process, you're not going to have the stability there or the lack of violence that will give you anything akin to something of a better life for the people of southern and eastern Afghanistan. I'll also say that I view our policies as being counterproductive. If you look where the stoning occurred near Kunduz, I believe, a few weeks ago or a month ago, that got all the attention. Well, that's an area where we actually have put more U.S. troops in this past year. So what has that done? That has caused people to become, I don't want to say radicalized, but has pushed people further towards traditional Pashtun values and towards the Taliban. I mean, that stoning that took place of that young couple, 200 people participated in it, and several hundred more observed. So we have to understand this as a cultural issue. And my view is that, yes, while in southern Afghanistan, the men keep their women locked away, they're treated as chattel, everyone also has cell phones there. And that's how you eventually reconcile this issue, is through information. But you don't do it through the barrel of a rifle. And I do not believe that the United States should have a policy of going to war to change someone else's culture. And then because then it becomes the same slippery slope argument you get as we find with, well, we have to be in Afghanistan because of Al-Qaeda. Well, there are 50 to 100 members of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, according to the CIA. According to the State Department last month, there are 1,000 to 2,000 members of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, let alone the numbers of members of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, Somalia, etc. Do we now, because we're interested in women's rights, we now go occupy the Congo because of the mass rapes that are occurring there? Trust me, my heart goes out to it. I've seen it firsthand. I lived among it. But my view is that you have to stop the violence. You have to resolve the conflict before you can get to any levels of human rights or women's rights issues that will be acceptable to the American psyche.
So, with apologies to people in the room, I have to get to another appointment, but I'll make my final comment just to amplify what Matthew said, since he referred to Iraq. In many people's observation, the status of women in Iraq took a step backward since the fall of Saddam Hussein. And as far as Afghanistan is concerned, one of the popular misconceptions is, with regard to the status of women, it's all Taliban versus non-Taliban, as if non-Taliban Pashtuns and other Afghans were paragons of gender equality. Nothing close to it. Okay, I'm sorry.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Appreciate your participation. Okay. Right in front of you, Andrew, in the blazer.
Hi, I'm Rob Dubois. I'm a run-of-the-mill security advisor. And I appreciate everybody's comments today. Divergent though they may be, you've all said very valuable things for all of us, and I appreciate that. Especially a couple of things Brian mentioned, that we can't make this only a security issue for the Americans. It's if we have international security, we're more safe, is what I think. What I extend it to assume from what you're saying, and I agree with that. Also, on the idea of self-interest, when we make it self-interest to Karzai, to the leaders, the paid leadership of Afghanistan, who pay for their seats from Karzai, we have. If we can convey to them, it's a messaging issue. I brought this up on numerous occasions. It's messaging, reaching them on their level, finding the levels of power that Darcy mentioned that go beyond the military. We have, I'm a military guy. I retired 4 years ago. I was in Leatherneck just a few months ago. I finished a tour of Afghanistan with at Leatherneck with the Marines. I want to talk to you about your buddy over there, the one you're talking about. But we do have many more angles. Joseph Nye, soft power, smart power, all these concepts. we need to dive deeper into what does make them tick. So how do we dive deeper into what makes them tick? How does the panel think we address Karzai's self-interest? Because I was in Uzbekistan. I watched the president drive through town at 100 miles an hour because he was afraid of dying at his own people's hands. That's not self-interest at its best, but that's the power-mongering perspective. That's the idea that if you just, in many of these cultures, rule by the fist and you'll be as successful as you can be, but they understand they have 3 to 30 years to live. And we have an understanding from our democratic background that you have infinite number of generations to live if you establish consistent, stable peace.
Okay. Charlie?
I want to paradoxically tie your question to the previous discussion because I think they're related, and in some ways Matt drew the linkage. And that is that even if difficult for us to understand, there are indigenous sources of political order in Afghanistan, and that we need to find a way of tapping into those sources of political order and bringing them up. Because what's happening now is that because this has been a fight that is principally militarized, we have ended up having to tolerate corruption. We have decided to leave off the fight against poppies. We are making no progress on women's rights, and it's largely because we're fighting a war and we are putting in abeyance these other goals because we need the cooperation of Karzai, because we need to pay the people in the fields, in the poppy fields. We don't want to uproot them and not have them have subsistence levels of income because then they're going to join the Taliban. So I think that the chain of causation is exactly as Matt laid it out. We need to push very, very hard on the front of political reconciliation, find a way of getting tribal elders and different groups to come together, because once we do that, and you have a semblance of order, that's when we can deal with human rights. That's when we can deal with the question of corruption. That's when we can deal with poppies. And so we can't fight our way there, but we can negotiate our way there.
Brian?
I think it's, as I mentioned, it's one of the most important questions. How do we actually shape the calculations of leaders like Karzai, but not only Karzai? And I have a modest suggestion. The U.S. should get its own policy on the same page because I think we have multiple agencies, and this is just from open source, but I think we have sometimes competing imperatives, which if you look at the front page of our newspaper, when you look at the corruption problem and certain people that are on the payroll of certain U.S. agencies, but then you have a separate issue of how we deal with Karzai and the broader leadership. And it's really not only an Afghanistan issue, it's an issue in Iraq, it's come up in Palestine all the time, but we, with our great power, still haven't picked that lock of how do we actually shape the calculations of a leader like Karzai. Just this year alone, we read him the Riot Act, the president actually flew to Kabul, and then we tried the full embrace with the red carpet approach. And we're not getting what we want, it seems, from that. And I think part of it is it's complicated, but the modest suggestion is we should at least have that political map in plan in the way that we do, I think, in terms of building the security forces and other elements. And that, I think, is the hardest part. It requires cultural knowledge, requires the sorts of things that Matt, others on this task force are talking about. And that's why I'm very pleased that this report brings those issues to the fore. But here we are, 9 years into it, and we still are, I think, puzzled over how to actually work with leaders like Karzai.
The lady in the row with the man with the bicycle helmet.
Hi, my name is Leslie Federini. I'm from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. And going to this idea of tapping into these native sources of political order, how, given that we don't really fully understand the culture and the politics in a place as complex as Afghanistan, do we start to develop these metrics to see if what we're doing, this new strategy that you all are proposing, is actually working? Because it seems to me that it is a long-term strategy, something that will take 5, 10, maybe 15 years, even if there aren't troops on the ground. How do we start to develop these metrics now to understand whether or not our strategy is actually working and be able to evaluate and possibly change course in the middle?
Let me start real quick and go to Bob. A lot of my experiences I draw from my time in Iraq and working with Iraq and, being on the embassy team in Iraq. And actually, Tony was there too. And being told that tribal system, those tribal leaders, those tribal chiefs, you will not work with them. You'll go to their meetings, you can give them Korans as gifts, you can patronize them, but you will not work with them. We didn't know that Saddam's government worked through them. So we have to have a better understanding of what we're actually involved in. I mean, I think a lot of people, a friend who's in the audience as well, he sent me a pretty snarky, off-color response to General Petraeus the other day saying, we don't know enough about how Afghan society works after being there 9 years. So I think that's one of the problems. And the other thing I'll say real quick is we do get tied up in metrics, but you know what? The U.S. military, God love them, if you give them a metric, they'll achieve it. If you tell them to turn that red dot to a green dot, they will do that. Now, what you get out of it may not be what you're looking for. And so one of the things I think that we need to understand more, look more into how we are trying to understand what's going on, is understand the narrative. Not just the metrics, but the narrative, the story that goes behind it. But Bob?
I think the metric issue is actually relatively simple, and I think that Iraq is the right place to go. There are lots of questions about in 2006 and 2007 of whether we should give $300 a month to people who are trying to kill us in Iraq. Well, we decided to take that risk. General Petraeus was one of the people deciding to take that risk. And within about a year and a half, 100,000 people were on the payroll. Well, it wasn't just simply giving them $300 a month not to kill us. We were interested in what were the attacks. Did suicide attacks and other ordinary attacks go down? Yes, they did, and we could measure them rather directly and actually in fine detail. And also, what about political movement? What about political councils? What about meetings, the Iraq Awakening Council, et cetera, et cetera? Were they occurring among those tribal leaders? We can call them, in Afghanistan, yurgas, we can call them tribal council meetings, but we can actually monitor whether or not that political process at the ground level is occurring month by month by month by month. I'm sure in Afghanistan, once we get into it, we could develop even richer metrics, but the basics, I think, are relatively straightforward.
Okay. And then we've got about 3-4 more minutes. So the lady in the brown hat there, please, and the gentleman in the tie right in front of her. Just ask your questions one after another, and then we'll answer them in succession, please.
Samira Daniels. I was wondering, looking at this a little bit differently, which is the on-the-ground interaction between the NGOs and people, the local population. Since I think you've been in Afghanistan, how would you characterize it? Because one of the concerns that I have is this whole, in terms of power sharing, is the problem of empowering people vis-a-vis the sort of NGOs. I mean, this is an issue that's occurred in India, and I was wondering what your opinion of that is.
Okay.
Mark Katz, Middle East Policy Council. I think it was Brian who mentioned the importance of the regional dimension, and I want to just ask a little bit about that. 2 days ago, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov came out with a rather surprising statement indicating that Russia was going to do everything it possibly could, sort of sending troops to Afghanistan to help the U.S. there. That Russia was going to be our ally on this. I'm just wondering, it's almost as if he read your report and said, no, don't listen to those folks on L Street. Stay in Afghanistan. And could you just maybe comment on why is it that they seem to be motivated? Why do they fear our withdrawal? And second, does it ultimately matter in the end that Russia now wants to help us? In other words, would you change your report now that you know that Lavrov is willing to give you all the support that Russia has to offer? Would that change anything, or is it simply too late? Thank you.
Okay, I'll respond. And Brian, if you want to take that, and then I just want to give time for Steve, who just came back in the room, to give us a final thought or two, since he is the organizer of this effort. With regards to the NGOs, we should be using them much more than we currently are. I think if you look at the United States efforts and the European nations' efforts through their institutional development offices, through USAID or DFID or whoever, it's been a failure. The United States alone has spent $50 billion in development funding in the second or third poorest country in the world, and you still have, besides the conflict, you still have a life expectancy of 44, you still have infant mortality of 1 in 5, you still have less than 10% of the people have access to electricity. The way we're going about our development work is not working. The key difference between what our development agencies do and what the NGOs do, and I think maybe why the NGOs are more effective, our development agencies have political motivations behind them, while the NGOs are there for humanitarian goals, and they tend to cut through things much easier and without the baggage. I'm also a believer that anyone who has read Andrew Wilder's work from Tufts University, my experiences both Iraq and Afghanistan confirm that reconstruction spending, development spending by the military, by U.S. government institutions does not reduce conflict. In fact, I concur with him, in the mid and long term it actually makes it worse. But Brian?
Yeah, I don't know specifically. I had not seen the statement by Lavrov, but I think it's interesting. I mean, one factoid about the Russians, I was talking to a senior U.S. official about this. People don't recognize that some of the senior commanders in the Afghan military that we're dependent on, that we actually lean on the most, they got a lot of their training from where? The Soviet Union. And actually spent a lot of time, much more longer than I think we're planning for our training exercises in Russia and the Soviet Union. I think the quiet thing that the Obama administration that has done with Russia, with many countries, they don't trumpet this as much, is the full court diplomatic press quietly. I know Ambassador Holbrooke has been to Russia, other places. They understand. And if you look at President Obama, I mean, thank heaven, we don't have the previous administration who thought we needed to do it all on our own. And if you look at the President's UN General Assembly speech last year, I think it articulated that others need to step up to the plate. And I think there's been a very fulsome, this is kind of the quiet story of what Ambassador Holbrooke, Dan Feldman, his whole team over there have been doing. They're very busy, and they don't do press conferences on it, trying to get others to pull their weight, because they recognize that it's not just about us. And I think that's the last thing I'll say here and conclude and hand over to Steve. With this report and other things, I think it's really hard for us in think tanks in Washington, D.C. to understand that it's not just about the United States. And we have this, our head is clouded by our exceptionalism. We are an exceptional nation. But we need to understand that others also have an interest in making sure that things don't collapse. And leveraging that, whether it's Karzai or whether it's other countries, that is, I think, the fundamental task right now. So.
You know, when Brian Katulish shared a lot of these ideas during a report, we called it the Tom Sawyer approach, you know, helping to get somebody else to paint your fence. I'm just off a plane from China as of yesterday, and in my discussions with Chinese government officials and party officials and policy people, they are astonished, in fact, that the United States is doing what it's doing, because it puts itself, sometimes it sees itself, what would it do in our role, and it wouldn't do what we're doing. It sees us kicking down our own hill. It's worried about this, and in fact, it would think that it would take a more multidimensional approach. Listen, I want to just conclude, thanking both the people who have been very involved in this report, thanking Matt Ho for taking over this panel as we're here today and continuing to work diligently over the next 6 months to a year or so to put this out. What we're trying to do is enhance serious dialogue and debate. We have many friends in the administration. Richard Holbrooke and I have talked a great deal. I've been invited to talk with his team. I think that his interagency team, for instance, is exactly the kind of thing that we need more of in government. But if things were going well, if this were, as Steve Cole just described, as I heard, simply a constitutional government arrayed against a bunch of bad guys, the benchmarks that the military and others have laid out for success would be working, in my view. Things aren't working. So the framing that we have had so far on this debate are not succeeding. And so it is in that spirit of the absence of success that we are trying to say it's time to basically come back and begin thinking about other inputs into that debate and discussion. And we're trying to create as constructive an on-ramp in our own report and thinking to that approach as possible. I think that the issues, and Steve Cole and I have talked about it. Steve is has been articulate and I think important, looking at the India-Pakistan dimensions, the regional proxy war dimensions of this conflict. We've also spent a lot of time looking at the political inclusion questions and the degree to which, as I think this is and Matt Ho thinks this is a raging civil war with lots of other pieces to it. And Steve was on a plane with Mike Mullen, he may have mentioned, to Kandahar with a number of other journalists, Joe Klein. and they came back somewhat chastened. Not Steve, because he knows all this already, but many of the other journalists, but also the military partners they had on the plane, realizing that the plans and the sort of basic building blocks and nodes that they thought were significant in understanding how to move into Kandahar were wrong, because they saw 5 or 6 or 7 mafioso-like families that basically ran everything, which didn't fit the construct that had come in. And so to a certain degree, there are lots of these things as you dig deeper and deeper, the complexity builds, but it also shows you, in our view, how important it is to take a step back and ask the fundamental questions about American interests. What goals are we trying to achieve? As Brian Katulis has also taught me, what's the end state we're really trying to frame as a way to discipline this discussion? You know, I think about geostrategic issues a lot, and one of my big concerns in all the hyperventilation that's recently been going on about Iran and whether to bomb Iran, I can tell you that sanctions, in my view, won't animate Iran. What Iran looks at is the map, and it sees if the United States isn't moving the needle in other areas of the geostrategic region in which it sits, Iran doesn't really worry about us because it sees us tied into a tar baby. And so there are larger geostrategic considerations. We cannot silo one of these problems away from everything else and need to look in the broader construct. And it's in that spirit that we offer this report. So I want to thank Robert Pape, Darcy Berner, Charlie Kupchan, Brian Katulis, Matt Ho, other members of the study group, and those who are not members of the study group for being involved in this debate and discussion. Thanks to our C-SPAN viewers, thanks to those people watching online, and thank you all for joining us today.